Good evening. Good evening, everyone. If you could please make your way to a seat, we're going to get started here. Welcome to the Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Andrew Finstuen. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Advancing American Values. I wonder if we could stop having the jazz music. I know I'm not that entertaining, but there we go. Thank you. So I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Advancing American Values, the organization that hosts the Distinguished Lecture Series, and tonight's speaker, Professor Wilfred McClay, who's going to speak to us about how to think about America's 250th birthday, because as you know, 2026, July 4th, 2026, marks that momentous occasion. A word about the Distinguished Lecture Series. For 2 decades, the series has brought leading academics, journalists, scientists, and more to promote the discussion of important issues that face our nation and the world. And before we launch into the discussion, I just want to have a few announcements, a few housekeeping items. First, please, if you have your cell phone, and I know you probably do, take it out, silence it, turn it off, whatever you need to do, but please have the cell phones silenced. You'll notice 2 microphones on either side of the stage here. That's for the Q&A portion. At the conclusion of Professor McClay's remarks, we'll ask you to queue up, and he'll alternate microphones for 20, 25 minutes, answering your questions to conclude the evening. You may have noticed all these wonderful people in the back and these tables. This is our civic engagement fair that Dr. Isaac Castellano, who's our Associate Director for the Institute, has helped organize, and we really appreciate all these organizations that have come out, because the Institute for Advancing American Values isn't just about having conversations and listening. It's definitely about that, but it's also about getting engaged with your community, and so we appreciate the partners that have come here tonight to offer up what it is that they're doing in the community and how you might get engaged. We also, there they are. Those students, those are undergraduate fellows of the Institute, and they're waving these pieces of paper at you, and I have one as well. It has a QR code on it. At the conclusion of the evening, they'll be handing them out, right at the conclusion, or at some point. They're going to hand them out. And if you don't mind, just clicking on that, it's a 3-question survey. We thought it would be interesting to ask 3 questions about the notion of the America 250. So one question is about what it is that you value, appreciate, what you're thinking about in terms of American 250. What you'd also like to see improvement toward, and what brought you out tonight. So just 3 basic questions. We're just curious to have that information, if you so choose. I have some thank yous. We have some sponsors tonight. Brighton Corporation, which is a residential and commercial development firm in the Treasure Valley, has been sponsoring this lecture series the last couple of years. Also, EP Wealth Advisors, which is a wealth management firm in town, formerly Buffington Moore McNeil, who has been sponsoring this series for the last decade. And also Boise State Public Radio. Let's give all our sponsors a round of applause. I also want to recognize the statewide America 250 Advisory Council. We have with us tonight Treasurer Julie Ellsworth, Representative Brandon Mitchell, Senator Ben Adams, and Janet Gallimore, who's the Executive Director of the Idaho State Historical Society. Please join me in thanking their support for America 250. Okay, what is the Institute for Advancing American Values? Because we get this question all the time, especially around the notion of American values. The questions we get, what values? What are they? Who decides? How have they operated in American life? Those are all really good questions. And the way we think about them at the Institute is first and foremost that everyone has values. No one is without values. They come from family, they come from education, religion, economics, politics, and more. And most everyone has values about the very notion of American values. Those values that are associated with this country, like life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, freedom of expression, equality, pluralism, public education, and opportunity. We generally agree that those are the values that are associated with this country. But we may disagree about how those values have been expressed in our history and in our policies. And that's consistent with the history of the United States. Nevertheless, the Institute asks all of us to talk and listen to one another about those very agreements and disagreements. And America 250 gives us precisely the occasion to be talking and listening about American history, celebrating it, examining it, and as Professor McClay says in one of his texts, sometimes offering searching self-criticism about our past. So tonight, as we anticipate July 4th, 2026, we join that ongoing conversation about how Americans from all walks of life, perspectives, dispositions, have been at the work of forming a more perfect union. And the Institute has been busy with that work, pursuing our mission to advance understanding and differing interpretations of the values that define and shape the United States, all in an effort to further respectful engagement and critical thinking in public education and in public life. So two things that are upcoming, one that you should probably try to attend, one that you won't probably be able to attend, events that we're working on. So on November 12th, here at Boise State University, in this building, in the Hatch Ballroom, Alana Redstone, the author of The Certainty Trap, will give a talk. And the certainty trap should be somewhat familiar to us in this moment. Whatever perspective, whatever disposition we come from, it's easy to find ourselves thinking that we have the answer, we know the truth. She's written a book about how the things we care most about typically are more complex than that. The other event we have upcoming in early November, myself and some colleagues from Boise State will travel to Michigan to put on a program called Michigan Listens, which is an outgrowth of a program we've been running in the state of Idaho for the last 3 years or so called Idaho Listens. And Idaho Listens is a privately funded event series that gets Idahoans from a cross-section of occupations, backgrounds, perspectives to speak about what they value and why. We've done 6 across the state. The speakers speak those out of that prompt, and here's the kicker, the audience remains silent. There's no talking, there's no clapping, there's no cheering, there's no jeering. It's just about what our philanthropist Greg Carr, who supports the project, says, reverent listening. So we've done that in Idaho, but we're trying to move that to America Listens, and Michigan is our first partner. So we're partnering with Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to put on Michigan Listens, and they're drawing speakers from across the whole state of Michigan with that very same format. So things we're doing here in Idaho through the Institute are reverberating, well, at least for now, to Michigan. The 250th, the semi-quincentennial, say it with me, semi-quincentennial, has special resonance for me because I'm a bicentennial baby. So I've just told you how old I am. And that's what got me interested in history. And as I've been speaking with Professor McClay, we've been kind of comparing birthday notes because we're talking about 2026, America's birthday. And it's interesting in ways these moments mark who we are and how we think about the past. And so we're privileged to have Professor McClay with us today. He came in last night. We had great conversation. He met with students earlier today. He's been gregarious, he's been engaging, insightful, and it's been wonderful to be engaged with him, especially with our students this afternoon. He gave some sense of his career trajectory and then just entertained questions. It was a wonderful hour with our students at Boise State. And now I'll introduce him formally and we'll get right to it. Wilfred M. McClay holds the Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization at Hillsdale College. Before coming to Hillsdale in the fall of 2021, he served as the Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma and the director of the Center for the History of Liberty. He's published widely, writing and editing 10 books, dozens of articles. His book, The Masterclass, Self and Society in Modern America, received the award for Best Book in American Intellectual History from the Organization of American Historians. At present, he is finishing the second edition of his Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. He served for 11 years on the National Council on Humanities, the advisory board for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and is currently a member of the U.S. Commission on the Semi-Quincentennial, which has been charged with planning the celebration of the nation's 250th birthday in 2026. He's received fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Academy of Education. He also served as a senior scholar, senior lecturer in American history at the University of Rome as a Fulbright scholar. Please join me in welcoming Professor McClay to the stage.
Thank you. I hope this is working. Is a microphone working? Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. It is wonderful to be here. It's really my first time in Idaho, and I hope not my last. I hope you won't tar and feather me and drive me out the door after this. It's an incredibly beautiful place you live in, and of course the Rangers arranged for a beautiful day, so I got to see it at its best. But I can't imagine it isn't at its best all the time. So I'll carry away very warm feelings about this beautiful spot, and hope to be back here sometime soon, maybe. So it's my first visit to the campus also, and I'd say all the things that I say about the region, about this campus. So very special occasion to be here. Well, we're here looking forward to begin looking forward to this 250th anniversary of the nation's birth. And by the way, I don't insist on the term semi-quincentennial. I am on that commission, but we really talk about it as America 250 now, because we kind of gave up on the trying to teach Latin to the entire population. So don't feel you have to learn to say it 5 times fast, which is pretty hard. Don't everybody start doing it now. But so we're looking forward to the 250th in less than a year, but we're also looking forward means looking backward to remember, thinking back to the first 4th of July in 1776, the date on which the United States emergence as a free and independent nation was proclaimed to the world by the Declaration of Independence, the document called the Declaration of Independence. That's what we celebrate in 2026, this event that stands at the center of our origins as a distinct people, the enduring flame of the American Revolution that fired the imaginations of brave men and women who fought to make this country possible against tremendous odds, against the leading empire in the world, and saw to it that what resulted would be a beacon to the rest of the world. The study of history has many uses, but this is primary among them, the work of memory, of remembering. No great or enduring human enterprise can be sustained without it. No matter how determined and focused we are, we're sure to lose our way unless we regularly look back and reorient ourselves, remembering where and how and why we began. Remembering our connection to what came before us, and particularly with those people who came before us. Without these points of reference, we not only forget the succession of historical events, the names and places and stories that form the warp and the woof of our common life. In the process, we also eventually forget who we are. Remembering who we are is not something that comes automatically. And what happens when we're no longer able to remember these things? Alzheimer's disease is perhaps the most dreaded affliction of our time. It's dreaded because it robs its victims of their memories. And in doing so, it robs them of their fundamental identity, their very sense of who or what they are. Too many of us today have had the unsettling experience of looking into the eyes of a loved one afflicted with this awful disease and being unsure whether that person that we once knew so well is still there behind the eyes, whether he's even capable of remembering who he is or recognizing who we are and the lifelong relationship that subsisted between us. Without the capacity for memory, such a loved one slips away from himself, from us, from our shared world, and finally vanishes into a fog of unknowing. A horrible fate. Well, what's true for individuals is also true for nations and peoples. What memory is for individuals, history is for civilizations. And without the reference points provided by historical memory, we soon forget who we are and we perish. But there's a crucial difference here. No one can be blamed for having contracted Alzheimer's disease. It's an organic condition. We don't understand the causes of it yet. We hope eventually we will. It's not a choice. But the American people can be blamed if we fail to know our own past and fail to pass that knowledge on to the rising generations. We will be the ones responsible for our own decline if that happens. And our societies become dangerously close to that state, having lost a general sense of the larger trajectory of our history. The fear that we Americans might lose our national soul by forgetting who we are and where we came from isn't something new. The young Abraham Lincoln expressed that same thought, that same anxiety in 1838. He's a very young man at this point, in one of his first, probably his first major speech, called On the Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. And he worried that as Americans' memories of the Great Revolution and the spirit of '76 faded away, so too would the underpinnings of the great American Republic, what he called the Temple of Liberty, that the revolution had made possible. In our own time, the problem is different, I think. It takes the form of a strange paradox. Actually, we know more and more about many, many details of the American past, partly due to the labors of people like me, battalions of specialized professional historians. But we actually know less because we lack a grasp of the overarching meaning of our history, the kind of meaning that helps shape the way we live together. We lack an adequate perspective on our history, a perspective that allows us to see the great achievements of American history in their proper light, properly weighed against our admitted failings and shortcomings in that history. We lack a shared sense of how exceptional our pioneering experiment in self-rule has been. We lack a sense of how full of darkness and despair and want and inequity most of human history has been by comparison. A sense of what a brilliant light came into the world with the events of the year 1776. So where to begin repairing this damage done by neglect of our past, of our history, and counteracting the misdeeds of omission and commission that are depriving us of our own legacy? Well, I think this anniversary that's approaching is a great place to start. Hence my title, How to Think About the 250th. So another way to think about it is in acknowledging what an exceptional moment in human history it was, and what an exceptional group of people the founding generation was. Let me explain what I mean. Historically speaking, not all moments are created equal. Yes, things are happening all the time, everywhere around us. A nonstop flood of passing moments. But history doesn't happen equally in all places and times. And you know this from your own experience. There are many times and places in which history has little interest, takes no notice. It generally doesn't deal with the vast stretches of ordinary time during which life goes on normally, during which men and women fall in love, have families, raise their children, bury their dead, and carry on with the many small acts of heroism, sacrifice, and devotion that mark the conduct of everyday life. These unhistoric acts, to use the word George Eliot uses in her wonderful novel Middlemarch, which I think many of you have read, the unhistoric acts of those who live faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. No, what we call history is something else. It concerns itself with the outbursts of the extraordinary, with those events and persons that invade the flow of everyday life, of ordinary time, and alter the direction of its currents. The history of ideas, which is what I study professionally, revolves around certain vital nodes of concentrated human activity, time periods and places where the steady stream of the everyday is interrupted by a concentrated surge of fresh intellectual energy and creative force, and thoughts and discussions and debates and institutions converge in ways that change the way we think and change the world. That's generally what we mean when we call events or persons historic, that their significance is not merely confined to the past, but it has an ongoing presence beyond their own time and helps to add to the treasury of civilization. These nodes of activity generally find their home in great cities: Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, Florence, London, Paris, New York, and Philadelphia. These nodes of concentrated activity come to life in groups of people, circles, salons, debating societies, political parties, schools, and universities, and not only in the minds of solitary geniuses. That's why we speak in the plural of the founders of the American nation. There of course were singular geniuses in these groups. But it's also important to stand back and think of the group as a whole, a group that embodies a circle of discourse, a circle that was capable of sustaining remarkably wise insights into the nature of political society, without which the things we celebrate as Americans would likely have never come to pass. It's also important to remember that although we often speak of the founders as if they were all of the same mind, that was definitely not the case. You could drive a truck through the differences between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and their wildly divergent views about the American future. And they were not the only ones to quarrel about the future. A great deal of conflict, debate, jostling, wrestling, and other forms of vigorous intellectual interchange were an important element in the emergence of the constitutional arrangements that carried the American nation forward into independent existence. Nobody got exactly what he wanted. And yet, as we'll see, the state of contention, of argument, far from being regrettable, has been a good thing, all to our good. It helped to model the kind of political order the Constitution would seek to establish, built on the recognition of disagreement and conflict as an inevitable part of all human affairs, especially in a free country. Okay, but you ask, what kind of conflict? And that is a good question. It's an interesting question. To begin answering it, let's consider the titles of three highly interesting, well-regarded recent books on the founding period. Just the titles here. Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation by Joseph Ellis, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Founding Partisans, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, and the Brawling Birth of American Politics by H.W. Branch. And Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson by Gordon Wood, arguably the dean of living historians of the United States. Now, did you notice the unifying theme here? These founding brothers They were also quarreling brothers, even brawling brothers. If they were friends, they were also friends who were often divided. And the political was often the personal. Ellis even argues in his book, that was the first of the ones I mentioned, that the constitutional system of checks and balances wasn't only a political theory, it was also a practical theory, grounded in the experience of quarreling brothers, quarreling leaders and regions with different visions and values. How did you bring them together? The Constitution served to codify in law the way those quarreling brothers dealt with their disputes. It's an interesting argument that he makes. So what held it all together and made it possible for the nation to run a gauntlet of challenges to the emergence of a free and independent America? What did all these figures have in common? The ground they shared was their awareness of what a great task history had set before them, and their understanding that this task was a responsibility they could not evade. They knew a distinct American people now existed, and it was up to them to devise a political regime suitable to govern them, and that their actions would determine what kind of future lay ahead for this great experiment. In short, they knew that they were founders. They knew that. They understood the importance of what they were doing. That's why they fought so hard. That understanding was a source of energy, but also a source of responsibility and a source of joy. Writing on July 3rd of 1776, John Adams gushed to his wife Abigail that the day of independence, and here let me quote from Adams, "The day of independence will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I'm apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as a day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore." I call that a gush. He did get one thing wrong. He predicted that this day would be July 2nd. And tough luck, it was Jefferson's Day, the 4th. And he continued. We're not through with Adams's gush. "You will think me," because he's writing to Abigail, his wife. If any of you are interested, their correspondence is one of the wonderful documents of early American history. "You will think me transported with enthusiasm." Yes, but I'm not. "I'm well aware," and he turns serious here, "of the toll and blood and treasure it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is worth, more than worth, all the means." So a few years later, after the war had been fought and won and a new constitution had been drafted but not yet adopted, Alexander Hamilton amplified this same theme in his own less enthusiastic way. This is during the debates over the ratification of the Constitution, which was very controversial. And he says this: "It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they're forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." Note the beginning of this. It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country to decide this question. It's a big load of responsibility. He continued, "If there be any truth in that remark, the crisis at which we're arrived may with propriety be regarded as the era in which that decision is to be made, and a wrong election on our part may, in this view, deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind." It's a lot of curlicues in the prose there, but you hear what he's saying. It's on us. It's on us to determine this question, whether governments can be reformed from reflection and choice by a rational process. A year later, George Washington, the greatest hero of the Revolution, the one man to whom all the quarreling factions tended to bow their heads, took the oath of office as president on a second-floor balcony in New York City Federal Hall, and the assembled crowd could watch him do this, could watch the historic event. Minutes later, he spoke before a joint session of Congress, of the new Congress, the first Congress under the Constitution. He said this: the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. So he said essentially what Hamilton said: it's on us to redeem the Republican, the small r Republican, the ideal of self-rule, of people ruling themselves rather than being ruled by monarchs and other such like tyrants. So, as I've said, they knew they were founders. They knew they had to be leaders of citizens, not leaders of subjects, citizens. And they grasped the magnitude of what it was that they had to found. They were committed to an experiment, the creation of a regime that protected the rights and liberties of self-governing citizens. And they knew, because they knew their history, about the fragility of these arrangements. Through all recorded history, republics were vulnerable. Republics were fragile. And they understood that anything that was called an experiment was a perilous thing, because experiments can fail. Experiment is not a sure thing. It was a voyage into uncharted waters, as likely to fail as to succeed. So here's another way to think about the 250th anniversary. Let's go back to the beginnings of this foundational voyage and look more closely at the document that we celebrate every July 4th, even if we are too busy setting off firecrackers to actually reread it, the Declaration of Independence, and its chief author, Thomas Jefferson. And here a bit of a surprise awaits us. Jefferson's intellectual brilliance was widely known, and he was not a particularly modest man. I mean, he designed his own tombstone and wrote the inscription to go on it. That's not a sign of tremendous, overwhelming modesty. But in a famous letter of 1825, the year before he died, to Henry Lee, he insisted on taking a modest approach to his role in the authorship of this document, the Declaration of Independence. It's the best account we have of what his thinking was. And it's offered in his old age, just a year before his death, almost exactly a year before his death. And this is what he said. The object of the Declaration was not to find out, here I'm quoting him, not to find out new principles or new arguments never thought of, not to say things or to which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. It was neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment or anything copied from any particular or previous writing. Instead, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. So Jefferson, this account of what the origins, of the intellectual origins of the Declaration, tells us something important. It tells us that there were all sorts of elements, diffuse, mingled elements, coursing through the words of the Declaration and of the nation it helped to create. There were a great many voices in the air, and that was true from the beginning. To understand the Declaration better and to understand the various sources of its strength and enduring appeal will benefit from doing a little disentangling so we can discern better some of the distinct voices. First of all, we should acknowledge that Jefferson himself was a man of the Enlightenment. And the Declaration is in many ways a document of the Enlightenment. It emphasizes reason. It emphasizes the natural rights of all human beings. It emphasizes the importance of the consent of the governed as a basis for legitimate government. It also, you might think of the Declaration's role abroad as an important inspiration to the French Revolution 13 years later and other revolutions and similar social movements in that century, in the 20th, and even unto the present day. So it was an Enlightenment document, but it was not only an Enlightenment document. There are many pre-Enlightenment elements in it, background assumptions that have to be taken account of if it's to be fully understood and its authority credited. For example, it drew on tradition, the culture, what I call the cultural muscle memory of a century and a half of colonial American self-government. Think of that. These colonies were used to governing themselves. They'd governed themselves for 150 years in some cases. And this, in turn, drew on a long tradition of English legal constitutional practices, going back at least as far as Magna Carta, which is 1215. You all remember that from high school. This element figures very prominently in the Declaration, not so much in the opening of the Declaration, but in the list of grievances that take up most of the space in the latter part of the Declaration. Nearly all of these grievances had to do with the colonists being deprived of customary self-rule, the things they were used to doing, and the violation of rights that were inherited and were due to them as colonists who were Englishmen. To put it bluntly, they were used to ruling themselves as they had done for 150 years or more. Such appeals differ fundamentally from an appeal to the idea of natural rights, of unalienable natural rights, as rights we have merely by virtue of being human. These earlier sets of rights are established by precedent, by custom. They're claimed as an inheritance from our forebears. They're not something everybody has. They're something that we have because of the line of descent, culturally speaking, that we enjoy. In other words, we do things this way because we've always done them this way, as did our fathers and mothers before us. And so, in the Declaration's long list of grievances against the British rulers, the kings accused of all kinds of things: weakening representative bodies, inhibiting judicial bodies, imposing unelected imperial officials, quartering standing armies in homes, and rendering troops unaccountable to law, and so on. You can read the list for yourself and see that almost nothing refers to natural rights. They're all to customary, inherited rights, traditional rights. Now, in reality, the distinction between this can be a little bit blurry. Jefferson himself notably believed in natural rights. It's at the beginning of the Declaration that we have these rights from nature. We're endowed with these rights by nature, and nature is God. But Jefferson also believed there was what he thought of as an ancient Anglo-Saxon constitution that was the root of the English Constitution. So he kind of had both ideas at once, that it was tradition, but it was also natural rights. Contradiction? Well, maybe, but people who are doing politics are not always consistent. Political documents have to have some give to be persuasive. But the larger point here is that the idea of a historical and traditional transmission of liberties through many centuries of British history is part of the story. It's part of the story of the Declaration of Independence. It's a reference point in the background of Anglo-American thought. So it's not just an Enlightenment document. The colonists were used to ruling themselves because they thought of themselves as Englishmen with customary rights of Englishmen. Finally, another voice, another element, is we need to stress the immense influence, and it's often ignored, of the colonists' religious sentiments as a background element in the American revolutionary tradition. Jefferson, of course, doesn't really mention this. He has a well-established reputation as a skeptic and critic of religious orthodoxy. But there are exceptions even to Jefferson. Consider this. Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, neither one of whom will win any prizes for their religiosity, both recommended that the Great Seal of the United States, which was very soon after the Declaration, the discussion of what the Great Seal of the United States should look like, they had an idea. It should depict the Exodus from the Bible, the great story, which is the foundational story of the Jewish people, in which the Israelites escaped their captivity as slaves in Egypt, and with the dramatic parting of the waters of the Red Sea, and they came into freedom in the land that God had promised them. This was what Franklin and Jefferson wanted the seal of the United States to look like. And here's how they described it. That the design should look like this. Moses standing on the shore and extending his hand over the sea, thereby causing the same to overwhelm Pharaoh, who's sitting in an open chariot, a crown on his head and a sword in his hand. He kind of looks in the versions of this like a sort of medieval king with that crown. Raised from a pillar of fire in the clouds, reaching to Moses, expressed that he acts by command of the deity. And then there was the motto for the seal. And here it is. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. So that's what Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson wanted the Great Seal of the United States to look like, instead of this sort of weird combination of things that we actually have. And I think that's significant, even though it didn't become the seal. This was not meant as a form of pandering, like, let's throw out some religious imagery for the rubes out there that actually believe this stuff. No, Jefferson liked the motto so much he used it, the rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. He used it on his own personal seal, his own stationery. So it was not a kind of concession to the great unwashed. So the story of the Exodus, not merely a story for the Jewish people, it's been a formative part of the Western heritage, the whole Western tradition, and particularly the American tradition, taking different shapes along the way. But you see it, the template of the Exodus, everywhere you look in American history, once you know to look for it. The New England Puritans, they described their perilous trek across the ocean in search of religious liberty as a repetition of the Israelites' flight to freedom, bringing them to a new Zion in a new world. You think of how many places in New England have Canaan, Zion, New Zion, names like that. The Latter-day Saints, who made the trek to the Salt Lake Valley under the leadership of Brigham Young, seeking relief from their own persecution, saw themselves in a similar light. Enslaved Africans south of the Ohio River looked to the Exodus story as an anticipatory symbol of their own eventual freedom, as they sang the wonderful songs, "Go down, Moses, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." Jefferson saw the Exodus in his own way, as an image of enlightenment and freedom. And I quote here from one of his last letters, "The signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves and assume the blessings and security of self-government." So it's an image from deep in the past, but right up to the moment of the American Revolution in the hands of a guy who really was a figure in the Enlightenment more than anything else. But one more example of Jefferson's hidden religiosity. And this is a powerful one. He penned no more searing words than these that are from his Notes on the State of Virginia, the one book that he wrote. And those of you who have been to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington will know it's inscribed on the northeast portico there. And let me read them. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we've removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. And of course, what he was talking about was slavery, the plague, the disease, the sin of slavery, which he was a institution he participated in himself, but also thought should be abolished. Very conflicted mind. But clearly the thought of a God, not just a deist God, but a God of the Hebrew Bible, is in his mind. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, his justice cannot sleep forever. So these elite figures in the American Revolution are influenced by religion, even if they sort of claim not to be. And it goes much deeper once you get past the elite. In the 18th century, American religious life was dominated by Reformed Protestant beliefs expressed vividly in the documents of the time, Revolutionary era sermons, public documents, newspaper editorials, political pamphlets. There was pervasive belief in the doctrine of original sin, which led to a deep suspicion of any form of concentrated power and opposition to imperial intrusions on a customary American life, particularly when coming from a mother country that they thought to be corrupt and arrogant and morally bankrupt. Britain's corruption was fodder for countless sermons, and these sermons were a contributor to a sense of rising self-consciousness and revolutionary sentiment. Here's a staggering number. It's been reliably estimated 80% of the political pamphlets of the revolutions were reprinted sermons. 80%. So the connection between religious sentiments and political activity was very strong. John Adams talked about religion in a little different way. His book, Thoughts on Government, was a guide to the drafting of the state constitutions. But he understood that there was a growing undercurrent of dissatisfaction that was one of the most potent causes of the revolution, more so than any political theory. And he wrote this in 1818, long after these events. And forgive me, this is I'll shorten this lengthy quotation. But he says, the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. A change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. And just to compress what he says, when the people believed the king was governing in justice in accordance with God's will, people thought themselves to pray for the king and queen and all the royal family. But when they saw those powers being corrupted, bent on the destruction of the security of Americans' lives, liberties, and property, if they thought it was their duty to pray for the Continental Congress and the 13 state congresses. In other words, to pray for the revolution. In other words, rebellion to tyrants was obedience to God. Adams, in his words, if not by rote, agreed with this idea, the motto, the rejected motto. So my point here is the Declaration is full of different voices, different perspectives. It's a great river of oratory fed by tributaries of all sorts, woven together, held together by the literary skills of the author of Jefferson and by the urgent needs of the moment in which it appeared. Its enduring appeal, as it approaches its 250th anniversary, is remarkable. You may recall that during the Hong Kong democracy protests that are fairly recent, the Statue of Liberty and the Declaration of Independence were held up as sort of talismanic figures. They still had that kind of meaning for what I think is that, let us hope, temporarily lost cause. And that brings me to the final way of thinking about our great national anniversary, and that's to reflect on the various ways that we've thought about it in the past. It's not always been the same. It's not a ritual. Here are a few examples. The 50th anniversary of the Revolution in 1826 was an astonishing moment because it was marked by the near simultaneous deaths of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the third and second presidents of the United States, men who had been enemies, friends divided, Gordon Wood's phrase, who became the best of friends in their later years, and their correspondence is one of the classic documents of early American history. But look at the fact that two of the most distinguished of the founders died on the same day, the 4th of July, 50 years after the Declaration, was widely seen as auspicious. Well, duh, who wouldn't see it as auspicious? What it symbolized the end of the revolutionary generation. It prompted pride in some quarters, but some people saw this as a sign of divine favor. Others were filled with apprehension about the future of the nation, the future of the founding principles that these guys had been so intent upon upholding. What was God, assuming this is some providential act, what was God telling us? What was God telling us about the fate of the revolution? Was it approving or disapproving? Up or down? Either one was possible. So the 50th anniversary was that elicited complicated emotions. There's not yet a book on this subject that should be written. I'm not going to do it, but it should be done. 26 years later, Frederick Douglass, the great American orator who born into slavery, who became one of the greatest abolitionists in the 19th century American history, gave a speech in 1852 called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" Delivered for the occasion of that anniversary. And it's an interesting speech. Many of you who will have read it, and you'll know that it combines, it's highly favorable to the founders. It's highly favorable to the Declaration. It's highly favorable to the Constitution. It ends with a kind of hymn to the Constitution. But in between, it is a scalding critique of American life, of the country's failure to live up to its ideals, particularly in matters of the treatment of Americans of African descent, not just prejudice, but the horrific institution of slavery, which was opposed to everything that our documents, including the Declaration, stood for. It was a harbinger of the Civil War, 1853. Civil War begins 9 years really later. But it's also a strong endorsement of the documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, to which the nation would have to return in order to reorder itself and find its way again. In a way, Abraham Lincoln, in the Gettysburg Address in 1863, does something similar with the Declaration. Going back 7 years ago, that's 1776 if you do the math. And similarly, reaching back to the past in order to reorient of the nation after a time of tribulation, or enduring in the case of the Gettysburg, towards a realizable future. The 100th anniversary, 1876, was the first observance after the Civil War. There was a proclamation by President Grant, the great hero of the Civil War, but it's really just a kind of bland thanksgiving to God. I mean, not that thanksgiving to God is inherently a bland thing, but it was coming at the end of Reconstruction, which was ending rather badly. And I'm sure that Grant, I can't know his mind, but it seemed to hold back from a greater enthusiasm that it might have expressed. And then finally, I'm getting near the end. There was, in 1926, Calvin Coolidge, not a president known for his oratory or eloquence, but commemorated the 150th anniversary of the American Revolution and offered a defense of the founding principles against the progressives like Woodrow Wilson, who sincerely believed that so much had changed since the 18th century. America had become the world's leading industrial society, leading economy of the world. It had vast inequities of wealth, vast corporate wealth. Private corporate interests were capable of manipulating the democratic system to their own ends, or so many people feared. Hence the feeling that the modern theories of government had to take this into account and to introduce new practices, new forms of regulation, and so on in their place. Well, Coolidge disagreed and gave a speech that I think is one of the great speeches, from Washington to Jefferson to Lincoln to Roosevelt to Reagan, in that succession. And a reminder to Americans of their revolution and what was special about it, what was exceptional about it. So I do have a long passage here, but I got to read the whole thing. So forgive me. This is Calvin Coolidge, 1926. About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It's often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776. We've had new thoughts, new experiences, which have given us a great advance over the people of that day. And we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. Believe me, he's addressing himself to Woodrow Wilson here in these words. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the government, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction which he can proceed is not forward, but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the Revolutionary Fathers. Well, these are words, I think, that Americans today, almost a century later, living in the second quarter of the 21st century, might be ready to hear with fresh ears. And now a final note. Many of us in our time feel obliged to look back at 1776 in as critical and dry-eyed a manner as possible. A manner that not only takes full account of the founders' moral and intellectual failings, but places those failings before all else when reflecting on our past. And it may surprise you for me to say, I think there's much about this disposition that speaks well of us. We are not afraid to be self-critical. We're not afraid to carry out our self-criticism in public, in the full view of the world. Our chief rivals in today's world, and even a great many of our allies, could never allow themselves to do the same. They believe that such candor would weaken them. We believe the opposite is true. We don't hesitate, to put it bluntly, to air our dirty laundry just because the world is watching. We should not, though, substitute a practice of relentless self-criticism for relentless self-congratulation. Neither one of these dispositions is right. A mature perspective on our past demands more of us than that. It demands that we seek a balance with full awareness of the fact that in the real world, even great ideals are often ignored or betrayed, and our heroes are always going to be flawed. But we do ourselves and the rising generations of young people no favors if we deny the greatness of what our country is, what it has achieved, and its potential to achieve much more in the years ahead. We should affirm those things, not least for the sake of those, some of our audience, who are coming of age today and looking for fields of endeavor that will prove just as fulfilling and admirable as Americans of the past times have enjoyed. Our founders were flawed. Flawed people are normal. But what's not normal or usual is for flawed people to come together to produce great things. This collection of remarkable men and women at this remarkable juncture of human history, almost 250 years ago, each of them contributed something to the outcome, even as they quarreled. We've never stopped quarreling. You may have noticed that we're quarreling a lot today. And yet, we've held together. Perhaps for the 250th, we should give thanks for that fact and at least take time out from our current quarrels long enough to lift a toast to those who helped to make this occasion possible. Thank you. Okay, so I want to invite you to ask questions, or if you'd like to sing, you have something to lighten the mood. Okay, we have a taker here. Oh, good. Okay. Let me let her go first. Yes.
When you talk about all the flowery terms that they used and imposed a higher being, when our wonderful Puritans set up the free schools, the reason for that was to get everyone to read the Bible, to be able to read.
Oh, sure.
And so if that was the only book in their home, no matter what they believed in, wouldn't their terms just be used in ordinary conversation? You were implying that because they were using these terms about God, that they believed in God, and some of them didn't.
Some of the Puritans.
Oh no, the Puritans definitely did. That's one of the reasons that came over from my class. Is
Try
it
again.
on now?
Is that better?
Okay. No, the reason that the schools were established were to get people to read the Bible, to make them able to read the Bible. And so wouldn't their terms that you were quoting be because that was probably their only document they had at home, so they just got used to using those terms?
Yeah, I really don't completely understand your question, but I mean, the reason they had the Bible, it was because they were Bible-believing Christians.
The parents believed in it, yes,
Yeah.
and I'm sure. But it's the only document they had at that time. Books weren't available to everyone.
So you're talking about people other than the Puritans?
No, I'm talking, the Puritans started the school systems in order to get people to read so that they could read the Bible.
Yeah, no, sure. And I think this is true not only of them, but of Protestants more generally. That
Right.
Protestantism I mean, there were high rates of literacy, very high rates of literacy in the colonies.
Right.
Because of Protestant emphasis on the ability of the individual to read the Bible rather than have their interpretation of the Bible mediated by priests and other individuals.
I was brought up Catholic, so I know that. Yes, but wouldn't you just use the words in the Bible and the phrases of the Bible are much more flowery than what we use today?
Yeah, that's where I lose you. I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Well, but some of the words that they used were from the Bible, both Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, just because that was the documents that they read. It's what they got
Well, now
used
Jefferson
to.
had, now wait a minute. Jefferson
had a great library. But
Yes.
Ben Franklin was very poor when he started off, and they usually just printed pamphlets because books just weren't the norm in a home then, right? No, I was
Well-
just wondering, I just think that the wording that our founders used were based,
There's another person asking a question.
okay,
About the question, yeah.
okay, I'm done.
Okay. Yes, sir.
So you talked about there's a lot of different driving forces behind the founding, like Christianity and natural rights and reason and tradition and all that. Do you think there's one that kind of stands out as like the primary force, or do you think it's kind of a mix of all
This
of
is
them
what
together?
this is what historians argue about, because some want to emphasize one thing more than another, and there certainly are wild debate. I mean, my position has always been that it's all of these things are present, and they may be in different settings, different cultural situations, different regions, different things have come to the fore. Certainly. And it's very, one of the things that's really curious about this is that you might think that Puritanism, that kind of Calvinist Protestantism, and Enlightenment science would be in opposition. They weren't. One of the John Winthrop, of course, was the famous founder of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and his grandson, I believe, was a professor of natural science at Harvard, and Jonathan Edwards, one of the great neo-Calvinist theologians of colonial period, was also really interested in John Locke and in Newton, and he participated in. So some of these categories mixed together too. So I'm. It's not out of timidity that I say this. I don't want to come down and say it was mainly an Enlightenment thing, because I think that doesn't take into account that the American Revolution had a strong element of popular energy. It wasn't just an elite movement. Big debate among historians about the American Revolution was the debate about was it how did Carl Becker? He said it was. Either was it about home rule or who would rule at home? Home rule meaning would the British control, or would we rule ourselves? But who would rule at home? Would the same elites that dominated when under a colonial setting continue to dominate, or would there be more? Would the liberties extend more widely? Would there be economic reforms? Would there be populism, and so that's actually a lot of people like to see the American Revolution as having been strictly a conservative revolution that preserved the rights of English. And others say, oh no, it had the elements of a social revolution, like the French Revolution, which was a total upheaval. You can find elements of both. So I'm not. What I wanted to emphasize, I think more than anything tonight, was that shouldn't leave the religious element out. It often is done. That 80% figure. I heard people gasp when I said that. It's amazing, partly because of the influence of religion, but the degree which religion and politics intersected, which is something we are very wary about. We want to keep them separate. That wasn't so much true at that time. And you had figures like John Witherspoon, who was one of the leading founders, but also a Presbyterian divine. So I hope that helps. I'm evading you. I don't want to come down on one side or another. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. When can I come back?
Yeah, it's a great place. It's my understanding that the founders didn't have a huge role built in for political parties. What are your thoughts on how the two parties have come to dominate our governance?
That's a very gently put point. It is one of the things that they were really wrong about. And I think even the sainted George Washington, who is really my favorite. I mean, the more I've studied George Washington, the more I love him. He's just amazing. But he was delusionary on this subject, that the idea that you could get by, that human affairs can be so arranged that every vote for every individual person has to be individualized, and that you wouldn't have people band together who shared either the same cause or could make coalitions based on, well, I know you care about this and I care about this, and we'll get our way if we join together. It's just the most natural thing in the world in political life. But no, there's no provision taken in the Constitution for the existence of political parties, and that was quite deliberate. I attribute some of this to Washington, but it's visible in others. They really felt that that the corruption of political parties in England, this has a big role to play, British political life, was one of the things that made them say, we want to avoid this here. We want to have a purer kind of republicanism. But of course, history, even like Roman history, which they all studied obsessively, it has its partisan divisions as well, and class divisions. So I think it was something that their wishful thinking kind of got the better of them. On the other hand, I'm not sure what provision they should have made that they didn't make. But it didn't take long. By the election of 1800, you had political parties. And you had the transfer of power from one political party to another. And thank goodness it went well. Although the campaign was vicious. And it is, if you think campaigns are bad, look at, there are a couple of good books on the election of 1800. It was nasty. I think even the Republican debates in 2016, which were really just kind of revolting, they can't lay a glove on the election of 1800. So we've been there. We've been there with this sort of ugliness of discourse, and I think political assassinations are another thing, and I think that's all very deeply concerning. But anyway, I think, yeah. Yes, sir.
I really appreciated your analogy of the Alzheimer's. It was a really powerful metaphor, I think, for...
Yeah, it's those of us who've been there with family members, it's really...
So I wanted to kind of just dive deeper into that and wondered what your prognosis is, so to speak, about where we're at right now, because you seem to draw that analogy of fading into that fog. And whether this is just part of the kind of normal vicissitudes of politics like you're talking about, or this is kind of an existential moment, and if so, what is, we have more facts like you said, what would you say is a practical remedy to bring that right interpretation to American history?
Well, you've just asked a very profound question, which is, are societies like organisms, do they have a rise and fall? I mean, and have we kind of exhausted, we had a great run, great prosperity, great, sort of world dominance, whatever, and now it's coming undone. I remember a lot of that talk, back in the 60s and 70s when things did seem coming unglued. More so than now, by the way, to me. I don't know what others here think about that. But on the other hand, I think there is a belief that that cultures can be renewed. there's a whole idea in the Western tradition of Renaissance, of a rebirth, a recovery of the past. I think that's as reasonable a prospect to look to as inevitable decline. So I choose that. And I think education is one of the reasons I'm in the line of work that I'm in. And Professor Andrew, I forgot your last name, Finstwin, is in. This is why we do this, because we have the hope that and cultures can change. They can change like that. They can change in a blink of an eye. And for good. I wrote this book, Land of Hope. I now people go around and tell me, you have to be hopeful. You're stuck with it. But I am hopeful. I am hopeful. Hope is not the same thing as optimism.
Just the plug, our school uses this. So I'm affiliated with the Hillsdale K-12 schools. So thank you for that
great.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah, we use that. So.
Well, that's really what we're all about. I mean, we think that I saw an interview with Larry Arnn just celebrated his 20th year as president of Hillsdale College, and they reprinted the article that the interview they did with him right after he arrived, and the reporter asked him, what was your intention in what are your intentions for this job? And he says, to save the country. So there's that's optimism. While up, yes.
Yeah, I appreciate the message of hope, and I really rely on that. I want to hear you reconcile a little bit, the origins of our country and the tie to religiosity and the need for a separation of church and state. I'm from Nampa, Idaho, where at the beginning of every city council meeting, they pray, and it says, "In God we trust," on the wall. It also says it on our money. I feel that there's, the surgence of Christian nationalism, and how do you reconcile that with the past in our religion?
Yeah. Okay. This is a great question, and I think the first thing I'd say is that the idea, it's very deep. The notions behind the idea of religious liberty that James Madison has a wonderful document called the Memorial and Remonstrance, which was in opposition to the assessment of taxes to support churches and clergy. And he opposed that. Patrick Henry was in favor of it. Interesting, these patriots who differed about this. And what Madison said is that we have a duty to worship our Creator, our Supreme Being, as we understand Him, her, it. That's a pre-political right, a pre-political obligation that no government can command. So I think a version of that idea that the soul has to be free, that in the Christian, Protestant Christian especially, tradition, the individual has to come freely to believe. It can't be coerced, it can't be prescribed by government doctrine. So how do you, now the question is, did that assume, your question is how you reconcile that with having "In God We Trust" on coins and city council meetings and that kind of thing. I think the tradition has been that a sort of generalized belief that and some people call it the civil religion, but a generalized, non-specific, non-denominational belief that in a supreme being to which all of us are in some way supervised, or exactly how to put it, I don't know, but that's part of the American tradition. And it's inclusive of Jews. It's inclusive, or should be, of other kinds of beliefs. It tolerates those who don't believe. But I think I think it would be a radical act to. There's a big debate about this in the 70s and 80s over what Richard John Newhouse called the naked public square. Should we have a naked public square? That is, should all manifestations of religion in public life be proscribed? Is that what the First Amendment requires? And no, that what the First Amendment requires, and you may remember, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now the question is, does having God we trust above your city council chambers, is that an establishment of religion? And this is being fought out in the courts. It's certainly not establishing the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or the Presbyterian Church or any specific ecclesial entity in the way that you see in England and you see in France and you see in Italy and you see in Sweden and all the countries that have or have had established churches that are supported by tax monies. So it's complicated, but I think here's how I would put it. To get separation of church and state as prescribed by the First Amendment is not the same thing as separation of religion from public life. They're two different things, I think. Yes?
I think it was that side.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, sir.
Thank you. I just want to preface what I'm about to say by saying that I think a lot of the discord that we have currently in the political climate in the United States can be solved if we all come to the general consensus on American values. The values like free capitalism, freedom of trade, things like that just consensus that we have as Americans. But my question was, in your lecture, you seem to affirm my pre-existing belief that the founders pursued this great conquest on the values of Christian or religious. And so I just wanted to ask you that, like, this relationship between church and state, how do you explain that in today's world, and versus, I know you explained in the lecture that, the founders pursued what they did based on their values. So how do you explain that?
Let me make sure I understand the question.
Yeah.
You mean that there was much more interpenetration of religion in public life then than there is now?
I would say that Christianity...
It's kind of the flip side of the other question that was asked.
Yeah, I mean, I would even argue that Christianity is embedded in the fabric of America. So how would you explain the separation of church and state in contrast to what you said in your lecture, which was that religion kind of inspired these men to pursue what they did?
Okay, I think I can answer that. And it's partly something I said a minute ago, but maybe I can say it better. That if we are committed to the notion of religious liberty, and this is actually, I mean, historically speaking, much more a Protestant thing than, say, Roman Catholic thing. Roman Catholics have sort of changed their teaching on this. John Paul II really changed, has a more, liberal view of religious liberty. But the idea being that one can't come, God wants our love, but he wants it given freely. And if it's not given freely, then it isn't. It's just the same as, you think of courtship. You want all the women to love you, but you don't want to kind of slip a drink in that's going to force her to love you. You want her to freely love you, and that's. I'm not being a very deep theologian here, but I think it's true that this is part of the motivation behind our notions of religious liberty, that love for obedience to God should be something that we do of our own free will. Any kind of, it's really important to preserve that freedom and not to force people to say, well, if you're going to be American, you've got to affirm these things, these catechetical principles of Christianity. People have to come to their beliefs freely without the government imposing them. That's why I think you can believe in the separation of church and state. The state can't come in and or the church can't come to the state and say, okay, we want you to enforce this. You want to enforce these beliefs. We can't have that. The church has its realm, and it's a private realm. It's separate from the power of government. There are a lot of people like Roger Williams who argued that was absolutely important for the purity of the church, not for the sake of politics, but for the sake of religion, that you needed to have this separation. So, this is making sense to you,
Yeah.
I hope?
Yeah.
So I think that it's one of the risks of having liberty is that that people can fall away from the faith. And you can also have, frankly, bad Supreme Court decisions that unnecessarily widen this separation beyond what any of the framers and founders would have wanted. I think that's happened. I think that, for example, the decision, not everybody in this room will agree with me about this, but I think the decision in Engel v. Vitale, which was the school prayer decision back in the 60s, was wrongly decided. I don't think there should be any problem with any problem with a non-denominational voluntary prayer. But the Supreme Court,
Because they weren't being forced to participate in the prayer.
that's right, it was voluntary.
Yeah.
But it was unacceptable even on those grounds. But I need to get to the other side here.
Professor McClay, that'll be the
Oh,
last question.
okay.
Are there points in our history that you can see have led us to the fascism that we're dealing with at the moment?
Well, I sort of disagree with the premise of the question, but Tom Wolfe, the guy who wrote Man in Full and the number of great novels, said, the specter of fascism is forever descending on America, and it always lands in Europe. Sinclair Lewis wrote a book in 1935 called "It Can Happen Here." It didn't, unless you take a really negative view of the New Deal, which some people do, as a form of fascism. But I don't even know how to answer that question, but I respect your right to ask.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You got to pronounce a benediction.